Chapter 21. Work that survives bad days. Most systems are built for ideal conditions. They assume a worker who is rested, clear, and motivated. They assume attention that arrives on time, emotional weather that stays mild, and energy that remains stable. Under those assumptions, almost any plan looks workable. The problem is that ideal conditions are not the normal state of a human life. They appear occasionally and disappear without warning. What you have most often is some mixture of fatigue, distraction, minor stress, and a mind that would prefer to be elsewhere. The question is not how to perform when you feel excellent. The question is what survives when you do not. Bad days are not exceptions. They are part of the operating environment. A person can call them bad because the mood is low, the body is tired, the mind is reactive, or because life has introduced friction that cannot be negotiated away. The category is broad, but the effect is similar. The worker is less precise, less patient, more prone to avoidance, more likely to interpret difficulty personally. When systems depend on the worker being at their best, the system collapses under these conditions. The day becomes improvisation. Improvisation becomes stress. Stress makes the day worse, and the worker begins losing not only output, but confidence. Work that survives bad days is built differently. It is built with the assumption that the operator will sometimes be compromised. This is not pessimism, it is respect for reality. A reliable system is not one that produces peak performance every day. It is one that prevents collapse. It is one that keeps work moving forward with dignity even when the inner climate is rough. The aim is continuity, not brilliance. Brilliance appears when it can. Continuity is the foundation that makes brilliance usable. Continuity requires that the work be made easier to re-enter than to avoid. Avoidance is always tempting on bad days because avoidance offers immediate relief. The mind feels heavy and it wants to remove the weight by stepping away. If stepping away is easy, it will happen. If re-entry is vague, it will be delayed. A system that survives bad days makes re-entry concrete. It reduces the ambiguity that bad day minds cannot tolerate. It does not require the worker to generate a plan while they are already depleted. Depletion does not only reduce energy, it reduces executive clarity. When people are tired or emotionally unsettled, they lose their ability to hold complex structures in mind. They become more impulsive and more easily overwhelmed by choice. This is why bad days often contain endless small tasks and almost no meaningful progress. Small tasks are easy to choose because they require little cognitive load. Meaningful work is often avoided because it requires decision, sequencing, and sustained contact. The worker calls this being busy. In reality, it is the mind protecting itself from complexity. A process that survives bad days reduces the complexity of starting. It does this not by making the work trivial, but by making the first contact small and unmistakable. It creates a narrow entry point into the task, something that does not require debate. Bad days cannot handle debate. Debate becomes emotional. Emotional debate becomes avoidance. A strong process removes debate by making the next step visible and bounded. Visibility is one of the most underestimated forms of support. A task that lives only in your mind becomes vulnerable on bad days because the mind cannot carry it cleanly. It becomes fog. It becomes guilt. It becomes an amorphous pressure that never resolves into action. When the task is externalized, written clearly, broken into concrete surfaces, it becomes less threatening. The worker does not have to remember what matters. The environment reminds them. This is not a hack. It is the basic principle of reliable operations. You do not ask fragile attention to carry what can be carried by structure. Structure is kindness without sentiment. It treats the worker as human. It assumes fluctuation. It anticipates that the operator will sometimes be impatient, scattered, or discouraged. Instead of asking for a heroic mood, it supplies a path. This is why well-designed processes feel almost boring. They are boring because they do not depend on emotional intensity. They are boring because they function. A bad day does not need inspiration. It needs rails. Rails are the difference between motion and drift. Drift is what happens when the day is unstructured. The worker moves from one stimulus to the next, handling whatever appears, never fully committing, never fully closing loops. Drift feels tiring because it contains no forward vector. At the end of a drifting day, the person is exhausted and strangely dissatisfied. A railed process, even in degraded form, produces a forward vector. It creates the sense of moving something from not done to done, even if what is done is smaller than usual. Smaller than usual is not failure, it is adaptation. The problem with bad days is often the internal narrative that they should not exist. The worker treats the day as defective and responds by either forcing unrealistic output or abandoning the day entirely. Both responses create cost. Forcing produces sloppiness and resentment. Abandoning produces guilt and backlog. A process that survives bad days implicitly allows for degraded performance. It expects that output will be less, that decisions will be slower, that the work will be more mechanical. It does not interpret this as moral weakness. It treats it as weather. Weather does not change the need for movement. It changes the way movement is done. A sophisticated process anticipates the weather by having different modes without turning them into a dramatic identity shift. It does not require you to call it a low-energy day or a high-energy day. It simply gives you an easy way to begin with what you have. Beginning is the most important act on a bad day, because beginning interrupts avoidance. Once contact is made, the day becomes usable again, even if imperfect. There is a difference between a bad day and a day you have abandoned. Many people conflate the two. They feel slightly off in the morning and decide quietly that the day is compromised. They begin treating it as a loss. They indulge small distractions, they postpone difficult tasks. The day becomes worse, and the worsening feels like confirmation. This is not a bad day. This is a day where the worker gave the internal disturbance full authority. A process that survives bad days reduces that authority by insisting on contact, not as punishment, but as continuity. Continuity is what prevents one bad day from becoming two. Backlog is one of the main ways emotional turbulence accumulates. When work is postponed, it does not disappear. It becomes future pressure. Future pressure alters present mood. A person begins dreading the next day not because the next day is objectively worse, but because the next day contains what was not handled today. This dread becomes another source of disturbance. The system begins spiraling, and the person experiences it as life getting harder, when it is often simply deferred contact returning with interest. Work that survives bad days is work that is designed to prevent deferred contact from compounding. This requires an unsentimental realism about what must be preserved. Not everything needs to be done on a bad day. The goal is not to keep the day identical. The goal is to keep the day from collapsing. There are usually a few critical threads that, if maintained, keep everything else recoverable. Communication that prevents misunderstanding, a small amount of forward movement on the most important project, a clean closure on what has been opened, a simple tracking of what is now at risk. These threads keep the future from becoming poisoned by the present. Poisoning the future is often what people do unintentionally when they treat bad days as permission to become chaotic. Chaos feels relieving at first because it removes standards. Standards create pressure, yet standards also create stability. When standards are dropped entirely, the system loses containment. Everything becomes a blur. The worker then has to rebuild containment later while also recovering from guilt and backlog. A stable process prevents this by keeping standards simple and non-negotiable in the areas that matter most. Non-negotiable does not mean intense, it means consistent. Consistency is easier to sustain on bad days. Intensity requires emotion. Consistency requires structure. A good process does not ask the worker to summon drive. It asks the worker to follow a small set of predictable steps that preserve the integrity of the work. Over time, this creates a deep kind of confidence. The person begins to trust that even on their worst days, they will not fully abandon themselves. Self-trust is built more on bad days than on good days. Good days create output. Bad days create identity. On good days, anyone can feel capable. On bad days, capability is tested. The worker who has processes that survive bad days begins to experience a new form of steadiness, the steadiness of not being dependent on the internal climate. They might still dislike bad days, they might still feel tired, yet they stop fearing them because bad days no longer threaten collapse. Collapse is what makes people anxious. It is not the workload itself, It is the fear that a single disturbance can knock the whole structure down. A robust process removes that fear by making the structure independent of mood. It creates a way of working that functions at lower capacity, the way a ship has systems that continue operating even when storms rise. The ship does not wait to feel calm. It continues. It adjusts. It preserves the essential functions. That preservation is what allows the ship to return to speed when the weather clears. A worker who has built such processes does not need to dramatize their internal state. They can be tired and still proceed. They can be irritated and still communicate cleanly. They can be discouraged and still take the next step. They are not suppressing emotion. They are refusing to make emotion the determinant of whether the day remains functional. Over time, this refusal becomes less like discipline and more like design. The person has built a way of working that assumes imperfection and therefore does not collapse when imperfection arrives. What remains is a quieter relationship with work. Work becomes less like a performance of being at your best and more like a craft practiced through varied conditions. The worker stops needing the day to feel good in order to be useful. They stop measuring their worth by how clean the mood is. They measure by whether contact was maintained, whether the important threads were preserved, whether the day remained coherent enough that tomorrow will not be burdened unnecessarily. In that sense, a process that survives bad days is not just a productivity strategy. It is a way of protecting your future attention. It keeps turbulence from becoming backlog, backlog from becoming dread, dread from becoming chronic stress. It turns bad days into smaller events instead of turning them into initiators of collapse. It does this quietly, without inspiration, without slogans, without drama, simply by respecting the basic truth that the worker will not always be at their best, and therefore the work must be built to survive them anyway.